Hi, I'm Dr. Kingon, and welcome to this quick review for APUSH. It's periods 1 and 2 together. I'm going to attempt to do a review of both of them in just 4 slides. So let's explore 1491 to 1754 together. The first theme that pulls periods 1 and 2 together is the theme of contact. And that is the contact between Europe, the Americas, and Africa, the collision of these three worlds, old worlds and new worlds. As Europeans are leaving Europe, searching for glory in exploration, for national pride, for riches and resources in the form of gold and silver, and also to further their religions, Protestant and Catholic, they end up invading the New World. And what they find there is a diverse array of native peoples settled all across the Americas in their geographic settings, where the geography has shaped the way in which those people have lived and developed their cultures. So some people live on seacoasts, some people live in colder, drier, more desert-like climates. Some people live on the broad, fertile plains, some in the river bottoms, and each of those geographic situations has shaped the world of these natives. Europeans will find that many of the natives live by growing maize or corn, which is a domesticated grass several thousand years ago in Mexico that became a major food source for native peoples and allowed them to expand their populations. Maize greatly increased the amount of calories available to North Americans and South Americans, and it led to some pretty big urban settlements. We might not think of them as urban in our terms, but they were large for their time and large in comparison to many European settlements. Places like Cahokia, near modern-day St. Louis, which may have had as many as 30,000 people around this central area of large mounds. When Europeans came, invaded, they brought people, they brought animals, they brought their food, and they brought diseases. In turn, they discovered people, animals, food, and diseases in the New World. And the exchanging of both of those we call the Columbian Exchange, as the new and the old worlds intermingle all of these biological elements. Many of the exchanges are positive, but many of them are negative. People in Europe, for example, will pick up new food supplies, potatoes, chocolate, maize, and that will allow them to expand European populations with new sources of calories. People living in the Americas will decline as a result of contact from disease like smallpox, flu, as well as the enslavement that they experience at the hands of Europeans. So this exchange of biological material creates winners and losers on both sides. The Europeans will trade with natives, and so the exchange of goods leads native peoples to adopt things that they find useful and adopt it into their own culture for use in the way that they see fit. But there are also conflicts, and those conflicts often revolve around land in which native peoples are being attacked and driven away by land-hungry Europeans. Many Europeans struggle to make sense of the position of the natives in the world. How do they fit within Christian narratives of creation? Here's this whole continent of people we didn't know about. And so how do we understand them? And many Europeans turn to a model of civilized versus uncivilized. And that helps Europeans to feel that they are superior, and that justifies their conquest of these native peoples and the taking of their lands. Now, it depends on which European people we're talking about, how that process unfolds. If we're talking the English are very focused on conquest. They want land for settlement. They want to trade. They're also very, very, very conflict heavy. There will be a lot of attacks, a lot of conflicts. And the English are relatively uninterested in converting native peoples. Yes, they do convert some, but the British, for the most part, the English, don't see intermingling with native peoples as a worthy goal of theirs. And so their conversions are half-hearted in many cases. The Spanish are looking for gold and silver, which means they will turn native peoples into a source of labor, the encomienda. They will convert native peoples to Catholicism, often through force, and that will lead to conflict and oppression of native peoples. But also native peoples will fight back, an example being the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. The French probably have the lightest touch in the New World because they are not looking necessarily for settlement. There are French farmers, habitants, who come to the Nouvelle-France, but the French are primarily wanting fur. And to get that, they can rely on native people to do the hunting and the trapping and the selling of these furs. The French will try to convert native peoples to Catholicism, but it's much less heavy-handed than the Spanish. And so it still comes with an air of superiority, but of all the European groups, the native peoples probably get along best with the French. A second theme will be government. Europeans invading into the New World will need to create an organization, a framework for governing this new world. And that, of course, differs depending on if we're talking Spain or France or England. The Spanish model is pretty tight in its governance. So they have viceroyalties, they have governors, they have precincts and districts, they have rules to follow. And that is very tightly governed, though not everything always perfectly works out for them. The English are very much more a private model. It's as if they sent Walmart into the New World to create a government through these joint stock companies, which are private companies allowed to settle the New World and therefore can govern themselves in a semi-autonomous way by their own rules, according to whatever rules the company adopts. The laxity of British government in its early years does increase the independence of colonists, and they do get the right to govern themselves. In New England, that's through the town meetings. In Virginia, that's the House of Burgesses. Every colonial British settlement will have self-governance built into it. That doesn't mean that the colonists are allowed to do whatever they want, and they are frequently in disagreement with England on things like Indian policy. How should the Indians be treated? How shall trade go? How should trade be regulated? What should we do about frontier defense? And even within the colonies, you will see an east-west split, oftentimes as the East Coast facing England tries to do what England says and sometimes ignores the concerns of what's going on in the West. A great example of that would be Bacon's Rebellion, where Westerners feel like they're being ignored by Easterners, and Easterners are not coming to the defense of the Westerners against Indian attacks. Britain does attempt to more tightly govern these colonies through a series of mercantilist acts, navigation acts, 1651, all the way into the 1690s. And the acts try to make sure the colonists are following the British way, but the colonists aren't interested in following along. They engage in a lot of smuggling, and the British eventually come to live with this, realizing that they still make enough money off the colonies to make it work. And the reason for that is the colonies actually like buying British products. They are engaged in a process of Anglicization, wanting to imitate, adopt, and utilize the culture of Mother England. We see this Anglicization even in British political culture, where the colonists are eagerly reading whatever Enlightenment thought is coming from England. So what does John Locke say about natural rights? Have you read that yet? Oh, read the latest when you get a chance to buy the book. So they're not just borrowing British tea culture and British clothing, British style. They're also borrowing British political culture as well. A third theme is economic. The colonies exist as a source of profit for Europe. Spain wants gold, France wants fur, England wants the staple crops that are produced. And that creates a robust economic exchange between Europe and America and Africa. This Atlantic exchange is often called triangular trade, linking Europe, Africa, and the colonies in an exchange of people as a commodity, the enslaved, raw materials like tobacco and rice and sugar, and finished goods coming from Europe. Native peoples are actually a part of this system of triangular trade. They are often providing fur and skins to Europe, and in exchange for things like bullets and alcohol and paint and clothing. In order to get the best trade deals and to keep Europeans out of their hair, native peoples will play Spain against France, or England against France, or England against the Dutch, or France against the Dutch, in order to try to get the best benefit out of this system. This economic trade is built on labor, and then there's a great deal of need for labor in colonial America. The Spanish rely on the encomienda, which is native people forced to farm and mine for the Spanish in exchange for, being converted to Catholicism and cared for. And the Spanish will use this until they switch to African slavery as recommended by Bartolomé de las Casas. The English colonists will also start with one system and then switch to race-based slavery. The English begin with indentured servitude, so you pay someone's way to America, and in exchange, when they get there, they work for you for 5 to 7 years till they get their freedom. Race-based African slavery in both Spain and the English world will become the dominant labor form as the supply of enslaved people increases through the 18th century. Starting around 1700, you can see the slave voyages increasing dramatically across the Atlantic. And this will flood the Americas with numerous people treated as property and as inferior beings, and often worked to death in the sugar plantations of the Americas, on the tobacco farms and the rice plantations. In the British colonial world, Each section of the colonies specialized in products that were environmentally suited for it. So England was not particularly good for farming, except on a small scale. So they do fish, dried fish, fur coming out of Canada, timber for shipbuilding. The middle colonies become well known for grains, so they are the breadbasket of colonial America. And the South produces tobacco in Virginia and rice in South Carolina. Each will have a labor supply that suits its needs. England doesn't need as much race-based African slavery. They do have it. The highest population will be in places like New York. New England will rely a lot on Indian slavery and then small-scale family labor. The middle colonies will have indentured servants and African slaves. The South will be the most committed to the race-based slave system. Our last theme for periods 1 and 2 involves the new societies created in the New World when you take and put people together on the North and the South American landscape, and you throw in people from Africa as well. There's a lot of social development that happens in the creation of these new societies. For one thing, Native peoples are going to resist the cultural and physical imperialism of Europeans. And so part of the story for them is fighting back against this invasion of their worlds. King Philip's War in New England in 1675, the Pueblo Revolt in 1680 are examples of fighting back. Even though they like trade and like the Atlantic economy and they like the trade goods they get, they are resentful of religious imperialism as well as the loss of their land. The Spanish will actually incorporate native peoples and Africans into their society through a caste system, the castas, which will define your identity. Spanish, are you Spanish and African? Are you African and Indian? Are you a mixture of all of those? And they will come up with elaborate names for this system. But as long as you're Catholic, you can fit somewhere in the social world. The British colonies, in terms of their social development, really depend on geography and economics. And that shapes a lot of how they socially develop. New England is settled by highly religious people who live in tight-knit towns as family groups. So they come as families, and the New England landscape is not going to encourage plantations, so towns it is, seaports. The Chesapeake is settled by people looking for profit, and tobacco becomes the way that happens for them, so they're spread out on plantations. They're more rural. Urban areas are not as developed there. The middle colonies are the most ethnically diverse, most religiously diverse, and they have the biggest of the urban places. New York in the middle colonies. Philadelphia is even bigger in this period. So you will see much more of an urban landscape, but you also see various religious folks, various ethnic groups, Germans, Swedes, etc., in the middle colonies. The British are settling this new world and seeing that the colonists themselves really do like the British culture of back home. This Anglicization we've already mentioned is reinforced by continuing ties between England and the colonies. Those ties are through transatlantic print culture, reading news from England, reading books from England. It's also religiously tied together when the First Great Awakening breaks out. It's both in the colonies and both in England. It helps bring them together under this idea that God is moving in both halves of the Atlantic. And we can't forget the social development of the enslaved, who are treated as property, but as human beings try to resist as much as possible the loss of their identity and their culture. It is not easy for them to do so, but you see them retain elements of it, especially in music, food, and they're fighting back to say that they do not accept their condition. A great example of fighting back would be the Stono Revolt in South Carolina in 1739, which is not successful, but it does illustrate how the enslaved are resisting the conditions that they face. That has been our 4-slide look at periods 1 and 2.